The air smelled of cordite and damp soil. Smoke drifted low over the fields, where burnt-out trucks and shattered helmets littered the road like relics of a dream that had ended too soon. The last of the Wehrmacht's 352nd Infantry Division staggered from the hedgerows, rifles slung over their shoulders, hands raised. American MPs shouted orders as they gathered the prisoners, nearly 300 men, mud-streaked, exhausted, their faces carved by disbelief. Among them was Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, 24 years old, an engineering student before the war. His uniform was torn, his boots filled with water, and in his hand he carried what was left of his division's flag. As he stepped forward to surrender, he braced for humiliation. The stories from the Eastern Front still haunted him what happened to Germans who were captured by the Soviets. But instead, the Americans did something unexpected. One GI, barely older than Hoffmann himself, handed him a cigarette. "You boys done fighting?" the soldier asked, his accent heavy, his tone calm. Hoffmann hesitated, then nodded. The GI lit the cigarette for him. "Welcome to the States," he said. Hoffmann didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, not mockery, not cruelty, but almost normal. That night, as the prisoners were loaded into trucks bound for the coast, Hoffmann sat beside an older sergeant named Otto Kessler, who stared out the window in silence. "Do you think they'll shoot us?" one of the younger soldiers whispered. Kessler shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "They don't look like men who shoot captives. They look like men who feed them." Outside, the American convoy rumbled through the night engines droning, headlights flickering on the rain-soaked road. For the first time since D-Day, the captured Germans felt something foreign and dangerous take root in their chests. It wasn't fear, it was hope. As dawn broke, the convoy reached a small French port, where the prisoners were herded aboard a transport ship bound west across the Atlantic. Hoffmann clutched his single photograph of home, thinking of his mother's kitchen, the sound of the church bell in his village. A guard leaned down and said something he didn't understand, then pointed upward to a painted sign over the ship's deck, U.S. Army Transport Service. He caught only one word, America. He didn't know it yet, but the next months would rewrite everything he thought he knew about enemies, dignity, and the meaning of work. August 3rd, 1944 Hampton Roads, Virginia. The grey transport ship cut through calm Atlantic waters, its decks crowded with silent men in tattered field uniforms. The German prisoners lined the rails, staring at the hazy outline of land that rose ahead, not the bombed ruins of Europe, but a vast, untouched coastline under a clear blue sky. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann stood among them, the salt wind stinging his face. He had expected barbed wire, guns, maybe dogs waiting on the pier. But as they docked, he saw no guards shouting, no searchlights, no hatred, just rows of U.S. Army trucks, white stars painted on the doors, and soldiers in clean uniforms guiding them with calm, practiced gestures. One American sergeant raised his hand and said slowly, in broken German, "Welcome to Camp Fort Hunt." The words hung strangely in the air. Prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. "They welcome us?" whispered Feldwebel Kessler. Within hours, the prisoners were processed, tagged, and loaded onto trains. To Hoffmann's surprise, the train cars weren't cattle wagons, but ordinary passenger coaches, cushioned seats, windows that opened. They were given sandwiches wrapped in paper real bread, slices of ham, and even a small apple. When Hoffmann bit into it, he almost laughed. "They feed us like tourists," he murmured. Kessler nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "If this is propaganda," he said, "it's working." 3 days later, they arrived at Camp Swift, Texas, one of hundreds of prisoner-of-war facilities scattered across America. As they stepped off the train, they saw not barbed wire misery, but a sprawling complex of wooden barracks, mess halls, and recreation yards. American soldiers waved them forward with quiet authority. "Form up, 2 lines," a guard shouted. "You'll get showers, new clothes, and an orientation." An orientation? Hoffmann blinked in disbelief. He thought of the cold indoctrination lectures he'd endured in Germany, how prisoners were to be treated as tools. as less than human. Yet here, the captors spoke with professional detachment, almost as if the Germans were guests on borrowed time. Inside the camp, the men were issued clean uniforms, khaki work clothes marked PW. Then came the rules, read aloud by an interpreter. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will receive 3 meals per day. You will not be forced to work against your will. If you choose to work, you will be paid. Paid. The word rippled through the barracks like a spark. Hoffmann turned to Kessler. They pay us. For what? Kessler frowned. For digging our graves, perhaps. But the next morning they learned otherwise. Trucks rolled in from local farms, and American officers called out names. Those willing to work were sent into the fields to harvest cotton and grain. They were given tools, gloves, and packed lunches. And when they returned that evening, dusty but unguarded, each man received a small paper chit canteen credits, redeemable for cigarettes, chocolate, or soap. The first night, Hoffmann sat on his bunk staring at the chit in his hand. It wasn't much, but it was earned. He looked at the American guard who walked past the window relaxed, humming, not cruel. For the first time, he whispered a thought he would never have dared say aloud back home. They don't hate us. They're teaching us. Kessler, listening, grunted. Teaching us what? Hoffmann held up the chit between his fingers. That freedom isn't won by fear. Outside, the Texas sky burned orange with sunset. Somewhere beyond the fence, a radio played Glenn Miller's In the Mood. For the first time in years, Hoffmann allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. September 1944, Camp Swift, Texas. The dawn light spilled across endless plains of wheat and dust. Trucks rumbled out from the gates of the POW camp, their beds crowded with German prisoners dressed in khaki work uniforms. Among them sat Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann and Feldwebel Otto Kessler. Their faces turned toward the horizon, the open land, the fields, and the unknown freedom that waited just beyond the barbed wire. When they first arrived, the idea of working for their captors had seemed unthinkable. Back in Germany, labor for prisoners was synonymous with punishment, degradation, the stripping away of humanity. But here, the Americans did something profoundly different. They trusted them. The truck stopped beside a large wheat field under a cloudless Texas sky. Farmers stood waiting, broad-shouldered men with sunburned faces and straw hats. Their tractors gleamed in the light, great roaring beasts of American industry. "All right, fellas," one of the farmers called out in English. "You work with us today. Same hours as my men. You'll get lunch, water, and a good ride back." Hoffmann didn't understand all the words, but the meaning was clear enough. The tone wasn't harsh. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. They worked side by side with American laborers, harvesting wheat beneath the brutal Sunday. It was hard work, but honest. Hoffmann's hands blistered and bled, but when the farmer handed him a cup of cold water at midday and said, "Good job, son," something inside him shifted. No salute, no barked order, just respect for effort. At the end of the day, the prisoners climbed back into the trucks, sweat-stained and sunburned, but strangely content. When they returned to camp, each man received his pay, a small credit slip marked with his name and the amount earned. Hoffmann stared at his 40 cents. It wasn't much, but it represented something he hadn't felt in years. Dignity. That evening, the camp's canteen came alive. Men lined up with their credits, trading them for coffee, soap, cigarettes, even paper and pencils. A few bought chocolate to send home in Red Cross parcels. For the first time since the war began, they could choose something for themselves. Kessler sat at a table counting his credits. "I used to build trucks for Daimler," he said. "We built for war. Now I pick cotton for Americans. Yet somehow, I feel freer than before." Hoffmann nodded, lighting a cigarette. "Maybe because no one here demands we salute." The camp's American commander, Captain James Carter, made rounds that night. He spoke fluent German, and as he passed, he stopped at Hoffmann's table. "How's the work treating you, Lieutenant?" Hoffmann hesitated. "Hard, but fair. Carter smiled. Good. You'll get used to that word fair. As he walked on, Hoffman watched him go, still unable to reconcile the contrast. In Germany, authority was feared. Here, it was respected, even liked. Weeks passed, and the system expanded. POWs repaired fences, canned vegetables, fixed farm equipment. Others were assigned to lumber camps, or even local factories under civilian supervision. They were never forced, only invited. And those who worked earned privileges, more rations, letters home, even a movie screening on Saturdays. One night, in the dim light of the barracks, Hoffman wrote in his notebook, "We came expecting cruelty. Instead, we found order without oppression. We were told America was weak, but this kindness has more power than any tank." Kessler looked over his shoulder and smirked. "Careful, Carl. You'll be a Democrat before you get back to the fatherland." Hoffman smiled faintly. "Maybe I'll just be human again." Outside, the prairie wind swept across the camp, rattling the fences. Yet somehow that fence no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a boundary between two worlds, one built on obedience and one built on trust. October 1944, Camp Swift, Texas. The mornings had grown cool. Mist rolled across the fields as the trucks departed each day, carrying the prisoners toward their work sites. By now, the routine had become familiar and strangely comforting. Wake at dawn, breakfast of oatmeal, coffee and bread. Roll call, then the day's work. Harvesting, repairing fences, hauling lumber. But something had changed inside the men. They no longer spoke with the bitterness of the defeated. They laughed more. They argued about music, about letters from home. They even sang while they worked old folk songs, not propaganda marches. Lieutenant Karl Hoffman noticed it most in the older sergeant, Otto Kessler. The man who once sneered at the Americans now traded jokes with the guards, and even helped one farmer repair his tractor engine. One afternoon, while working in a barn, Hoffman overheard the farmer, Mr. Lawrence, talking to Kessler through an interpreter. "You boys do good work," the farmer said. "Reminds me of my own sons. They're fighting in France right now." Kessler looked down, uncomfortable. "Perhaps they fought against us." The farmer nodded, chewing on his pipe. "Maybe so. But that's war. Out here, we're just men trying to make a living." Later, back in camp, Kessler sat on his bunk, staring at his hands. "He called me a man," he said quietly. "Not an enemy, a man." Hoffman smiled. Maybe that's all he saw. Now, inside the camp, the POWs began organizing themselves into communities. Some ran classes, English lessons, mathematics, carpentry. Others formed orchestras, choirs, even theater groups. The Americans allowed it, even encouraged it. Captain James Carter believed that structure kept men sane. "We give them purpose," he told his adjutant. "A man with purpose doesn't cause trouble." But it became more than that. Purpose turned into pride. The German prisoners began maintaining the camp themselves, tending gardens, repairing roofs, painting the barracks. In one corner, Hoffman and a few others started a small library using books donated by local townspeople. When an American chaplain visited, he offered them access to the camp chapel on Sundays. "All faiths welcome," he said, "even if you pray for peace in German." That night, Hoffman wrote in his journal, "We thought the Americans would break us. Instead, they restored us. They treat us not as prisoners of war, but as men learning what freedom actually means." The work continued through the fall. On one farm, Hoffman helped bring in a final harvest before winter. When the truck arrived to take them back, the farmer pressed a small bag into his hand, apples, still warm from the Sunday. "For dich," the man said, his German awkward but kind. "For you." Hoffman tried to refuse. "Nein, bitte. I can't." The farmer smiled. "Yes, you can. You earned it." Back at camp, he shared the apples with the men in his barracks. They sat quietly, savoring the sweetness. For a moment, they weren't soldiers or captives. They were simply human beings, sharing food, laughter, and peace. Kessler broke the silence. "If this is defeat," he said softly, "then maybe we deserved it." Hoffman looked at him. "No, Otto, this isn't defeat. It's a lesson. Not..." From outside came the sound of a phonograph American swing music drifting through the camp, carried by the night wind. For the first time since the war began, Hoffman closed his eyes and felt the absence of hatred. He thought of his mother's voice, of the quiet of home, and whispered to himself, "So this is how a nation wins, not with fear, but with fairness." Oh, the camp lights dimmed, and the men fell asleep not as enemies, but as witnesses to a truth their homeland had never dared to teach them. January 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. The winter air carried the faint scent of pine and coal smoke. Inside the barracks, frost lined the windows, but the men were warm not just from the potbelly stove in the corner, but from something deeper, something rebuilding quietly inside them. Lieutenant Karl Hoffman awoke early each morning now, long before roll call. He liked the quiet, the time before the camp stirred, when the horizon glowed pink and the world outside the wire looked endless. He had begun to see the work details differently. It was no longer forced labor. It was participation, a shared rhythm with the Americans. Each day, his crew left the camp to work at a local lumber mill, helping cut and haul timber. The mill's foreman, Tom Sanders, was a gruff man with a heavy accent from Oklahoma. He spoke no German, but he had a gift for gestures and laughter. "Work steady," Sanders would say, patting the air saws. "No fingers, no fun." And somehow, they understood. In the beginning, the prisoners worked carefully, afraid of punishment, but there was none. Sanders expected competence, not obedience. When a machine broke, he didn't shout, he handed the wrench to whoever stood closest. Hoffman learned to operate the circular saw, to grease gears, to calibrate the mill's belts. It was hard, honest work, and when he finished a shift, covered in sawdust and sweat, he felt something strange, useful. During breaks, the Americans shared their lunches. Bologna sandwiches, boiled eggs, sometimes a piece of pie wrapped in wax paper. They traded stories through laughter and broken words. One young worker, Earl, drew pictures in the dust to explain baseball, leaving the Germans confused but fascinated. "You hit the ball," Earl said, miming a swing. "Then you run not away from danger but toward home." The Germans laughed, though the metaphor wasn't lost on them. At night, back in the camp, Hoffman shared what he'd learned with others, how to fix a saw, how to read blueprints. He taught basic mechanics to younger prisoners who'd never worked outside the military. "We fought to destroy," he said one night, sketching on a scrap of paper. "Now we build." In February, Captain James Carter announced that work teams with good behavior would be allowed to send money home through the Red Cross, their wages converted into Deutsche Marks. The men were stunned. "Paid? To our families?" Kessler asked. "From the enemy?" "Yes," Carter replied. "War ends. Humanity shouldn't." That evening, as snow drifted softly across the camp yard, Hoffman sat at his small desk, writing a letter to his mother. "Dearest Mutter, I am safe. They let us work, and they pay us. I help cut wood and repair machines. The Americans treat us better than we treated our own laborers. I do not understand this mercy, but I feel it changing me. If this is America, then perhaps the war is already lost, and rightly so." He sealed the letter with trembling hands. Later that week, something remarkable happened. The local lumber company sent a thank you note to Captain Carter, praising the German prisoners for their work ethic and good conduct. Carter read it aloud in the mess hall. "They say you men work harder than most free laborers. You've earned their respect and mine." The room erupted in applause, quiet but heartfelt. For the first time, Hoffman didn't feel like a number. He felt like a man again, one defined not by orders or ideology, but by effort and integrity. That night, he stood outside under the stars with Kessler. The Texan wind was cold, but the sky was impossibly wide. "You know," Kessler said, "if the Führer saw this, he'd call it weakness." Hoffman looked toward the faint glow of the distant town, a place that once would have terrified him. Then maybe the Führer never understood strength, he replied. Kessler nodded slowly. No, he only understood control. The two men stood in silence for a long time, the sound of the lumber trucks fading into the night. Inside the barracks, the men slept with tired hands and quiet hearts. In a place built for captives, they had discovered something they'd never known in freedom, the dignity of honest work, freely given. April 1945, Texas Hill Country. Spring came to the plains like a slow breath, green shoots pushing through cracked earth, the sound of birds returning to the wind. By now, the war in Europe was collapsing. Rumors rippled through the camp like wildfire. Hitler was surrounded, Berlin under siege, the Reich dissolving. But inside Camp Swift, life had taken on a strange serenity. The men no longer felt like prisoners. They were farmhands, mechanics, builders, workers, in a land that no longer treated them as tools of ideology, but as human beings. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann sat one morning outside the barracks, polishing a wooden handle for a plough repair. Across from him, Otto Kessler was mending a pair of work gloves. The two men had spent months side by side in fields, factories, and quiet evenings over coffee from the canteen. Kessler looked up. Karl, do you ever forget the uniform? Hoffmann thought for a moment, then nodded. When I'm working. Yes. Then that's freedom, Kessler said simply. That afternoon, their work detail took them to a nearby family farm owned by John and Mary Whittaker, an elderly couple whose sons were serving overseas. The Whittakers greeted them not with suspicion, but with nods of gratitude. Mary handed out sandwiches and lemonade while the men repaired a broken windmill. We don't have the strength we used to, she said with a smile, but you boys do. One of the younger prisoners, Heinz, couldn't stop staring at her not out of disrespect, but disbelief. They feed us, even though we fought their sons, he whispered in German. Yes, Hoffmann said quietly, because they know the war is not here. For weeks, the men worked on the Whittakers' property building fences, digging irrigation ditches, helping in the barn. In the evenings, Mary often brought out her radio, letting them listen to the news or to music. One night, Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade played softly across the porch. The prisoners sat quietly, sipping lemonade as the sun dipped behind the hills. Mary looked over and said, "You remind me of my boys, just far from home." No one spoke for a long time. Then Hoffmann said softly, "Your kindness, we did not expect it." Mary smiled sadly. Maybe that's what makes it kindness. Oh. When the truck came to take them back to camp that night, she handed Hoffmann a small brown paper bag. "For your men," she said. Inside were cookies and a folded note that read, "No man is an enemy when he works with his hands and eats with his heart." Back at camp, the prisoners gathered around the bag, sharing the cookies in silence. Kessler held up the note and said, "Imagine a woman whose sons fight us, writing this." Hoffmann nodded. "In Germany, we were told the Americans were decadent, soulless, yet they have shown us more soul than all our speeches ever did." Days later, word reached them. Germany had surrendered. The guards didn't celebrate. They didn't mock. They simply removed their helmets, stood before the prisoners and said quietly, "It's over." No cheers, no jeers, just the sound of the Texas wind moving through the fences. That evening, Captain James Carter addressed the camp. "Gentlemen," he said, "the war is finished. You are still our responsibility and our guests until we arrange your return home. Until then, work if you wish, rest if you need. You've earned that choice." Choice. The word struck Hoffmann like a revelation. That night, as the camp lights flickered out, he wrote his final entry before sleep. "We fought for a world of control and hierarchy. Here, we learned a world of choice and fairness. We came as soldiers, we will leave as men." As dawn rose the next day, Hoffmann looked through the fence toward the endless open plains. For the first time, the horizon didn't look like the edge of captivity. It looked like possibility. He whispered to Kessler beside him, "They didn't just defeat us, Otto. They changed us." And somewhere beyond the wire, A farmer's tractor engine rumbled to life, steady, unjudging, free. August 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. The war was over. The radio confirmed it daily. Japan had surrendered, and the world was, at last, silent. But in the quiet of Camp Swift, the German prisoners felt something deeper than relief. They felt the weight of transformation. The morning of their departure began with the clang of the mess hall bell. Sunlight broke across the barbed wire and guard towers, not as a warning this time, but as a benediction. The prisoners gathered in formation one last time, their khaki uniforms faded, their boots worn smooth by a year of honest labor. Captain James Carter stood before them, reading from a clipboard. His voice was steady, almost fatherly. "Men, today you'll begin the first leg of your journey home. You've served your time here with discipline and dignity. You've worked hard, lived honestly, and shown respect. America thanks you for that." He looked up, meeting their eyes one by one. "I hope, when you return to your homeland, you'll take something of this place with you, not the fences, but what's inside them." A murmur moved through the ranks, quiet emotion, half pride, half disbelief. Lieutenant Karl Hoffman stood near the front. His face was older now, tanned and lean from months of work. In his breast pocket, folded neatly, was the note from Mary Whitaker. "No man is an enemy when he works with his hands and eats with his heart. M." The trucks waited beyond the gates, engines idling softly. As they loaded up, Otto Kessler turned to Hoffman. "Strange, isn't it?" he said. "When I first arrived, I thought this fence meant captivity. Now it feels like protection." Hoffman nodded. "Yes, from what we used to be." Before boarding, Captain Carter stopped him. "Lieutenant Hoffman," he said, extending a hand. "I read your reports, your work at the lumber mill, your teaching. You're a fine leader." Hoffman hesitated, then shook his hand firmly. "And you, Captain, are a fine conqueror." Carter smiled faintly. "I'd rather be a decent man than a great conqueror." The trucks rolled out, carrying the men toward the train station. Civilians along the roads waved as they passed, not in triumph, but in farewell. Some farmers even held up small signs. "Danke," written in chalk. When they stopped for water near the Whitaker farm, Mary herself appeared at the fence line, holding a basket of peaches. "For the road," she said, passing them through the wire. Hoffman took one, unable to find words. He simply bowed. Mary nodded, smiling through tears. "Go rebuild something better." That night, the prisoners boarded the train east, their windows open to the warm Texas wind. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks lulled them into silence. Each man stared into the dark, wondering what waited beyond the ocean. Kessler leaned back, exhaling. "Do you think Germany will understand what happened here?" Hoffman turned the peach over in his hands. "Not yet," he said, "but one day they'll build something that does." In his pocket, the canteen chit, his first wage earned in America, still rested beside the folded note, symbols of a truth that had outlasted the war. When dawn broke over the plains, the horizon glowed gold. Hoffman closed his eyes and whispered, "They didn't just defeat us with weapons. They defeated us with fairness." He opened the window wider, breathing the clean air of the country that had captured his body and somehow redeemed his soul. Far behind, Camp Swift shrank into the distance. The fences gleamed faintly in the sunrise, no longer barriers, but reminders of a place where enemies learned to be men again. November 1946, Bremerhaven, Germany. Cold mist hung over the harbour as the Liberty ship docked, its deck crowded with men in faded khaki marked PW. The long journey across the Atlantic had been quiet, filled with nervous laughter and heavy silence. For many, it was the first glimpse of home in years, though home no longer looked like anything they remembered. Lieutenant Karl Hoffman stood near the railing, his hands gripping the cold metal. Beyond the docks, bombed-out buildings rose like blackened teeth. Smoke still drifted from the ruins. The great German ports, once proud symbols of industry, were now ghost cities. Beside him, Otto Kessler exhaled slowly. "So, this is what we fought for," he muttered. Hoffman nodded. "No, Otto, this is what we fought against without knowing it." When the ship's ramp dropped, the men shuffled ashore. American and British officers checked papers, issued ration coupons, and gave short speeches. "You are free men now," one British officer said. "Go rebuild, go home." But for many, home no longer existed. Hoffman made his way to his village near Kassel, traveling by train through a landscape of ruined fields, cratered, bridges collapsed, cities reduced to stone and memory. When he arrived, he found his family home burned to its foundations. Only the church steeple still stood, crooked but unbroken. He wandered through the empty streets until an old neighbor, Frau Bauer, recognized him. She ran to him, tears in her eyes. "Karl, we thought you were dead." "I was," Hoffman said quietly. "In a way." She fed him warm soup and told him what had happened, his mother gone, his brother missing, the town surviving on aid from the Americans. He listened in silence, then pulled from his coat pocket 2 relics from Texas, a faded canteen chit and a folded paper note. He placed them on the table. "These," he said softly, "kept me alive. Not the food, not the camp, this." Frau Bauer unfolded the note, her hands trembling. She read aloud, "No man is an enemy when he works with his hands and eats with his heart." She looked at him, eyes wet. "Did an American write this?" Hoffman nodded. "A farmer's wife. She fed me. She paid me. She treated me like a man, not a monster." Frau Bauer shook her head in wonder. "And you were their prisoner?" "Yes," Hoffman said. "But I learned more about freedom behind their fences than I ever did under our flags." He stayed in the village, repairing what little remained: roofs, doors, machines. Soon, other returning POWs joined him. They formed a small workshop, rebuilding carts and farm tools. Hoffman insisted on paying everyone equally. "No ranks here," he said. "Only work." The British occupation authorities noticed the effort and sent supplies: lumber, metal, seeds. One officer asked Hoffman how he managed to keep morale so high. Hoffman smiled faintly. "Because we learned from the Americans that dignity is the best wage a man can earn." By spring, the workshop had grown into a cooperative. They repaired tractors, plows, even bicycles. Hoffman hung the American note above the door, written now in both English and German. "Kein Mensch ist ein Feind, wenn mit seinen Händen arbeitet und mit seinem Herzen ist." Villagers began calling it the Work of Hands Hall. Farmers came from miles around to trade, barter, and rebuild. For the first time in years, laughter returned to the valley. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Kessler arrived from Bremen, a pack over his shoulder. "Still building, I see," he said, smiling. Hoffman clasped his hand. "Always." They sat on the steps, watching smoke curl from the chimneys. The sound of hammers echoed through the street, the heartbeat of renewal. "You know," Kessler said, "we used to think power came from command, from control." Hoffman nodded. "And now?" Kessler smiled. "Now I know it comes from trust." They sat in silence as the church bell rang over the ruins, not as a symbol of victory but of return. And for the first time in years, Hoffman felt no shame, no fear, no hatred, only gratitude for the strange land that had taught him how to be human again. He looked east toward the rising moon and whispered, almost as a prayer, "In their hands, I was a prisoner. In their work, I found my freedom." Spring, 1948, Kassel, West Germany. The air was filled with the rhythm of rebuilding. Hammers on wood, saws on stone, children laughing where silence had once reigned. 2 years had passed since Lieutenant Karl Hoffman returned from America, but the lessons he carried across the Atlantic had taken deeper root than he could have imagined. His small cooperative, once a handful of men with salvaged tools, had grown into a community workshop, a place where ex-soldiers, widows, and refugees all worked side by side. There were no uniforms now, no ranks, no ideology, only work and the quiet pride that came with it. Hoffman moved among the rows of benches, checking each project. One team was restoring farm carts, Another built furniture from reclaimed lumber. In one corner, young apprentices were welding under the supervision of Otto Kessler, his old comrade from Texas. The older man's face was lined but peaceful. "You see that boy, Carl?" Kessler said, nodding toward a young worker smoothing a wooden wheel. "His father died in Stalingrad. He's never known a day of peace until now." Hoffman smiled faintly. "Then he's learning faster than we did." That afternoon, a visitor arrived, an American officer from the Marshall Plan Administration. His name was Major Robert Leland, once an engineer with the Army Corps, now helping oversee reconstruction projects. Hoffman recognized him the moment he stepped through the door. "Major Leland?" he said in astonishment. "You inspected our camp in Texas?" Leland's eyes widened in surprise, then softened into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned. Lieutenant Hoffman." They shook hands warmly, enemies no longer. Leland looked around the workshop, clearly impressed. "This is your doing?" Hoffman shrugged. "Ours. All of ours." Leland ran a hand over a freshly built plow. "Looks American," he said. "Simple, durable." "That's the point," Hoffman replied. "You taught us that simplicity works. Now we teach it to everyone who will listen." As they talked, Kessler brought over mugs of coffee. Leland sipped it slowly, watching the men at work. "You know," he said, "most people back home think Germany is still angry, broken. No." Hoffman glanced around the workshop at the hum of tools, the laughter, the sense of shared purpose. "Some are," he admitted, "but many of us found a different kind of education, not in lectures but in labor, in being treated as men when we no longer deserved it." Leland nodded thoughtfully. "I always wondered if that kindness made a difference." "It did," Hoffman said quietly. "You gave us back our sense of worth. When a man earns an honest wage, even from his former enemy, he stops being a prisoner." That evening, the villagers gathered for a meal under the open rafters of the hall. Someone had set up a gramophone, and music drifted through the twilight. Old folk songs mingled with a few crackling American records. Leland sat beside Hoffman, listening. "You know," he said, "this feels more like a family than a factory." Hoffman smiled. "That's what work should feel like." Later, as the lamps flickered and the last song faded, Hoffman took a small envelope from his jacket and handed it to Leland. Inside was the faded canteen chit he had kept since 1944, the first payment he'd ever received as a prisoner. "I kept this," he said, "to remind me that even behind a fence, a man's labor has value if it's respected. It helped me rebuild my country." Leland studied it for a moment, then handed it back. "Keep it," he said. "It belongs to history now, your history." May. Outside, the night smelled of earth and rain, the scent of renewal. Kessler joined them at the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag. "You think the next generation will remember all this?" he asked. "They'll forget the war," Hoffman said softly. "But maybe they'll inherit the lesson." "What lesson?" "That no nation, no man is truly defeated if he learns how to work with his hands and live with his heart." They stood in silence as the workshop lights dimmed one by one, their glow spreading like embers through the valley. From somewhere beyond the hills, a train whistle blew steady, confident, free, and Hoffman, watching it fade into the distance, thought of the fences of Camp Swift, the kindness of strangers, and the strange miracle that mercy had built. He whispered the same words that had once been handed to him on a scrap of paper in a Texas field. "No man is an enemy when he works with his hands and eats with his heart." Summer, 1955, Bonn, West Germany. A decade had passed since the war, yet its echoes still shaped every cobblestone, every rebuilt wall. The cities were rising again, cleaner, humbler, wiser. The people worked not for conquest, but for continuity. And among those helping guide this reborn nation was Carl Hoffman, now grey at the temples, a quiet man with the bearing of both engineer and philosopher. His cooperative workshop had grown into a small manufacturing company building tractors, tools, and farming equipment exported to countries that, only 10 years earlier, had been enemies. Each machine that left his factory carried a small engraving on its frame, made with hands and heart. It wasn't a slogan, it was a creed. One morning, Hoffman received a letter stamped with an American postmark. Inside was a short note written in neat script. Dear Mr. Hoffman, my husband, Captain James Carter, passed away last winter. He often spoke of your conduct at Camp Swift and the respect you earned among both prisoners and guards. He said, "Those men will go home and rebuild something better than what they lost." I believe he was right. Mary Carter. Hoffman sat in silence for a long time after reading it. The name stirred a flood of memory. The Texas wind, the laughter of American farmers, the faces of guards who had treated their captives not as defeated soldiers but as men waiting to remember who they were. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it beside two things he had never parted with: the faded canteen chit and the note from Mary Whitaker, the farmer's wife who had fed him cookies and kindness. That afternoon he gathered his workers for their weekly meeting. Many were young born during the war, too young to remember it. Hoffman spoke to them not as a boss, but as a teacher. "You have all heard stories of what Germany once was," he said, "and you live in the Germany that is becoming. But there was a time, in between those two worlds, when we learned something extraordinary from the people we thought were our enemies." He paused, letting the room fall silent. "When I was a prisoner in America, we worked. We built fences, harvested crops, repaired machines. But they paid us, they thanked us. They trusted us. And because of that, we learned that work done freely with fairness can change a man's heart." He held up the old note, yellowed and fragile. "A woman gave me this once. She said, 'No man is an enemy when he works with his hands and eats with his heart.' I have carried it ever since." The room was quiet. Only the sound of distant hammering echoed through the open windows, a sound of peace born from industry. Afterward, Hoffman stepped outside. The factory yard was alive with motion. Men tightening bolts, testing engines, laughing. Beyond the gate, children played near the riverbank. The air smelled of oil, grass, and renewal. Kessler approached, older and slower now, his eyes gentle. "Still quoting the Americans, Carl?" Hoffman smiled. "No. Quoting life." "This." Kessler nodded toward the workshop. "You think they'd be proud of this?" Hoffman looked toward the horizon west, across the ocean, toward a land that had once held him behind wire and taught him freedom. "I think they'd understand it," he said. "And maybe that's enough." He placed a hand on the old fence post by the gate salvaged from their first workshop in 1946. Rusted, splintered, but still standing. "Strange," he said softly. "A man can cross an ocean, survive a war, lose everything, and still be rebuilt by kindness." Kessler smiled. "Maybe that's what victory really is." As the sun dipped below the rooftops, the last shift whistle blew, and the yard filled with the hum of engines. Hoffman watched the tractors roll out one by one, each bound for a world that had learned, painfully and beautifully, that decency outlasts destruction. He thought of Camp Swift, of Captain Carter, of Mary Whitaker, and of every nameless GI who had handed a cigarette, a sandwich, or a chance to men they might have hated. And as the wind brushed through the valley, carrying the scent of oil and wheat, he whispered to himself, half prayer, half memory. "They conquered us with fairness. They rebuilt us with work. And they freed us with respect." The sound of machinery blended with birdsong, a harmony of labor and life. In that moment, under the golden light of peace, Carl Hoffman finally understood. What began as captivity in Texas had become the quiet engine of Germany's rebirth.